Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm going to give it some time, as always, to let everyone file in and grab their coffee, settle in. Of course, I'm bringing up coffee because in case you haven't heard, we are promoting Land Development Academy with some mugs. So if you've attended 2 sessions or more of Land Development Academy, you're eligible for a Land Development Academy coffee mug as supplies last. Okay. I sent out an email to most of the people who are already eligible for that. I didn't have everyone's email address because it's a long list. We've had a lot of great participation. But if you believe that you're eligible for a mug and you'd like to pick one up, you can always email me and we'll coordinate that distribution. And I'm going to go ahead and put my email address in the chat in case anyone doesn't have it.
Do I get a mug if I do another one of these?
Yes. So that's actually a good question. So staff who've attended as attendees are not eligible for a mug, only our community members, but our presenters do get mugs. So yeah.
Right.
Because we want to thank y'all for being here and thank you for presenting and all that. If without our subject matter experts and without our attendees, we wouldn't have this program. So yeah. Just gonna give it a couple more minutes as folks come in. Again, thanks all for being here and good morning. We'll take you into the afternoon. I do see some folks are still entering the room, so get started at 5 after. So today we're going to be starting kind of like a section all about water. Today's development in Austin's wetlands, and then in November we've got water quality requirements in Austin and drainage requirements in Austin. So water is life, y'all. We're going to be talking about water starting today. Wetlands are one of our most natural sources. My name is Bianca Machuda. If you haven't met me yet, I am the Community Engagement Specialist for the Development Services Department. And once again, thank you all for being here. Our Land Development Academy sessions offer a deeper look at the site plan review process from experts across the City of Austin departments who work with site plans. So, as usual, if you're with a group of people, I would like for you to enter into the chat how many people are in your group with you today. If you're just a single participant, you don't need to say anything, but if you're sitting in a conference room with 5 people, let us know. We want to know how many people are here. We want to track our participation. So we'll go to the next slide. I want to review today's engagement format. So we've got an hour set aside for today's program, and we'll start with a presentation and close with a Q&A session. And the questions can be posted throughout the presentation to the Q&A bank at any time by selecting the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And you can see what that looks like there on the slide. It says Q&A. So it is different from the chat function. If you're having any issues with that, you can chat one of the meeting hosts and we can troubleshoot with you. And your other option for asking a question would be to use the raised hand function, which is also at the bottom of your screen, but that'll be at the end with the question and answer session. So throughout, you can type them in the Q&A box, and at the end, you can raise your hand and verbally pose your question. So while we hope to be able to answer all of your questions, if there are anywhere, we don't have the information, we will post a follow-up response. You'll be getting a written Q&A summary sometime after this presentation. And also just an FYI that this meeting is being recorded, and you'll all receive a link to the presentation and the recording at some point as well. So that's our housekeeping, and I'll hand it over to John Clement, our expert, who is going to present today.
Hey, everyone. My name's John Clement, and I'm with the Watershed Protection Department at the city. I've been in watershed since 2013, previously working in the floodplain health program, and now working in environmental policy and review, where I manage some site plan reviewers. One of them, Miranda Reinhardt's, on here, and we'll try to keep up on questions in the chat as needed, and flag things down if I really need to go back and make something more clear. But yeah, we're here today to talk about wetlands, and what you see here is just a graphic representation of how you transition from upland areas down into fully aquatic areas. Plants change as you go from drier areas into wetter, like riparian or floodplain forests. And then as you approach the shoreline of the banks of the river or a creek, you start seeing vegetation change pretty quickly. You see stuff that you don't see elsewhere. And then as you move further into the water, you get into generally aquatic things that just grow in the water. Our area of interest is these things kind of on the fringes, where the soil gets saturated quite often, and we have plants growing there that you don't necessarily see elsewhere. And that is kind of, we'll get into the details of it, but kind of where we wound up on the definition of a wetland, where you have these saturated soils that has a big impact on the plants that grow there, and on insects and other organisms that might be living in the soil, because obviously non-plant organisms need to be adapted to that environment, and then the plants themselves, the presence of all that water tends to push out all the oxygen. Plants don't get enough oxygen and they die. So a number of plants have evolved to be adapted to that system. And all that is largely governed by the presence of water, at least intermittently, throughout the year, making it essentially unlivable for a lot of the plants you see around, and producing these unique communities. So on a big scale, if you're thinking about wetlands, it could be this is the Everglades on the left, and Caddo Lake on the right, which is probably the state of Texas's largest wetland community. And again, unique plants, abundant water, and all that affects the soil there that provides the substrate for these plants to grow on. Of course, in Austin and Central Texas, things look a little different. We don't have that much water, but we do have areas where there's perennially, constantly water, or at least intermittently water, that is there often enough that it leads to these unique plant communities. And this is a pretty typical example, a little perennial stream that has a bunch of bushy bluestem and other plants adapted to this environment around it. Also, we've got old stock ponds like you see on the left. If they're in areas where there's a pretty high groundwater table, they'll stay saturated a lot of times, and you get these unique communities, including, like in this one, floating aquatic plants. And on the right, that's another local creek with a lot of unique vegetation in it. And just a couple more local wetlands. In these cases, they're distinguished by the cattails you can see in the back, indicating the availability of a lot of water throughout the year. And then we also have these funny things, mostly out west. As you start getting into the hill country, get up on the Balcones Escarpment, is what are called slope wetlands. So these are not in low-lying areas. There's not a bunch of pooled water around. What you have is perched water table, and you're in an area with a little more topography like that. So you've got steeper slopes. You have groundwater that water is infiltrated into the soil, hits some kind of impermeable layer, and then just starts moving laterally and finds a steep slope, and you get vegetation. This is big muley on the left, and another big patch of bushy blue stem on the right. And that photo on the right is actually this funny patch here. This is a undeveloped parkland in Northwest Austin, Ridgeline Neighborhood Park. Part is the city parks department is working on a plan now to develop this and put in boardwalks and make it more of a nice little feature that people can visit and check out the wildlife and see what else is going on there. Um, so again, kind of going back to what is a wetland. The term wetland, from my reading, seems to have not really been used in any official capacity in the literature until 1956, when the Fish and Wildlife Service published this report on the value of wetlands to waterfowl, and the impacts of modern development on wetlands, and therefore on wildlife and resources associated with that. And they covered all sorts of stuff. They said wetlands, so those are bogs, marshes, swamps, wet meadows, potholes, sloughs, and river overflow lands, which is a lot of different stuff. And they said, well, these are all wetlands, but they didn't actually define a wetland and say, this is how you know it's a wetland. It's just sort of a, when you see it kind of thing, again, being focused on this idea of intermittent or frequent or constant inundation of water. What they did do, because they were concerned about impacts to waterfowl and other wildlife, was assess, estimate what they thought was the total amount of wetlands in the United States at that time. And they came up with a number of 125 million acres. And they also estimated that by that time, the 1950s, probably 45 million acres of wetlands had been lost to both urban and agricultural development. But as I said, they didn't tell you how to decide whether or not something is a wetland. They just said, oh, these are wetlands. And that persisted actually until the 1970s, as we'll see. Now, prior to this was, people standing up and saying, hey, there's something going on here. These might need to be preserved. Here's an estimate of, what we're doing and ideas on what we might be doing wrong. In the 19th century, when is when, as a nation, we started really paying attention to these, bogs and low-lying areas and so forth. And that resulted in the Swampland Acts, which actually focused on the draining of wetlands. They deeded federal swamplands, at the time, westward expansion. The government owned a lot of land because there wasn't anyone else out there to own it. And these areas that could potentially be reclaimed, land was dedicated if someone had a plan and the ability to carry out that plan to drain these areas, fill these areas, etc., either for agricultural purposes or for disease control if they're near an urban area, or for development generally. And again, these big wetland areas, the Everglades and Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana, were significantly impacted by this in terms of um, the amount of water available and the amount of wetland surface available, the amount of habitat available, and so forth, as these areas got built up or as the waterways were routed and rerouted in various ways to help reclaim the land. And going along with that, like on a small scale, um, not just these big federal land grants, but individual farmers, prior to the mechanization of agriculture, uh, would do what they could to drain these areas, also to provide more arable land that they could grow more crops on. And then early 20th century, that greatly accelerated as mechanized farming came into being. And you make the investment in your equipment and you need your equipment to pay off, so you need more arable land. You also can manage it more efficiently, so you can do more in the same amount of time. That helped drive more draining of agricultural wetlands early on in the 20th century. And as that was happening, people did, prior to that 1956 report, the USDA, of all people, noted in 1938 the potential problems with this in a paper called The Problem, Drained Areas and Wildlife Habitat. And again, they're not using the term wetlands here because that um, the wasn't really made use of much until 1956. But I think it's interesting, seeing the USDA come out with kind of environmental perspective in the 1930s. And they say here, under pioneer conditions, the rules for the treatment of wildlife are immediate exploitation of the useful and the drastic reduction of the useless. And go on to say that as areas are being developed, that the land units with the natural exempt occupants, whether that's beavers or muskrats or um, wildfowl or waterfowl, that under the circumstances, people aren't aware that those areas may be worth far more than anything man could put in their place, and that once destroyed may never be reestablished. And these are ideas that came into the fore much more so in the 60s. Um, the environmental movement really got a boost by a couple of things that happened. One was actually the Cold War, which drove expansion of the university system and the science that could then be generated by that, and also by the expansion of government scientific agencies, um, which also contributed to the science, and then try to take a more specifically practical approach to solving problems as they arose. This generated a lot of highly trained people who could go out and make observations and do studies and take a look at what we're doing with the world or to the world. And they kind of then the the big splash in terms of public awareness was the publication of Silent Spring in the 60s by Rachel Carson, not associated with wetlands specifically, but looking at the impacts of pesticides on insect communities and then how that affects, um, again, going on up the food chain, impacts waterfowl and other organisms. Um, so the accumulation of all that scientific information and the translation of that into public concern kind of helped kick off the environmental movement in the 60s, which ultimately then, not until the 70s, led to passage of the Clean Water Act, which protected the waters of the United States, which is a whole thing we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on, but that impacted filling and draining of wetlands. And then later in the 70s, so that was done by Nixon. President Carter then signed executive orders requiring that if you're a federal project or if you're receiving funding from the federal government, you have to incorporate protection of wetlands and floodplains into your project. So this then led to kind of the creation of a new industry, the environmental professional who could go out and determine what is and is not the waters of the United States and what is and is not a wetland. Um, and then that finally leads in 1979 to the paper I mentioned before, uh, classification of wetlands and deep water habitats of the United States, where someone finally in 1979 says, this is how you know whether or not something's a wetland. And of course, that followed 7 years after the actual federal rule saying we need to protect wetlands, but better late than never. Um, so that's kind of the big picture on that, and getting back again to um, what's going on with wetlands. You have saturated soils. The plant communities change over time once the soil becomes saturated because there's relatively few plants that are adapted to that environment. Then over a longer period of time, the soil starts changing due to the lack of oxygen in the soil. It develops along a different pathway than it would if it weren't saturated. And you take these together, um, water and the characteristic plants and characteristic soils. That's how these folks wound up defining what a wetland is. And in fact, they've got it right here in the abstract. Wetlands are defined by plants, soils, and frequency of flooding. So you get unique plants in these environments. The soils change over time. They have a lot of visible characteristics that you go, okay, this is a hydric soil, which is going to be a potential indicator of a wetland. And then you've got some frequency of flooding, inundation, or other sort of source of saturated water. And then again, as far as this new industry that arose, the government's generated quite a bit of literature over the years to help us actually decide, what is a hydric soil, what plants that are indicators to one degree or another of wetlands, and how do you combine these to determine where the edge of a wetland actually is. So that's kind of the big picture, going from swampland acts through the recognition of the potential value of wetlands, on into figuring out what a wetland is and what are we doing to them and why they're important. Um, so then getting back on down to more of a local level, looking at the wetlands that we do have with our stock tanks and our small streams and so forth. What are they doing? Wetlands, as stormwater goes through them, they help process the nutrients and other pollutants, and they capture sediment. Also, by typically being these kind of in these low-lying areas of the landscape, the floodwaters are allowed to spread out. That slows down the flows and helps mitigate flooding downstream. Also, that storage, as the water does more slowly leave that area, that protects base flow in creeks by kind of extending the discharge curve in the channel, which then also supports groundwater, and you have healthier waterways going on downstream. And then, for our urban environments, another thing, these areas, if you protect them and you don't develop them, you have more green space available. And green space, these are, wetlands are pretty unique as features in urban or suburban landscapes as well. More water means more plants, means more habitat and more biodiversity, all of which are good things. Also, these areas provide more shade if they're undeveloped, more evaporative cooling. And if you're familiar with the term urban heat island, they help mitigate the effects of urban heat island, all this concrete out here. absorbing heat from solar radiation and radiating it back out into our environment. And then there's the recreational opportunities of, getting out and seeing what's going on in these natural areas. And then just the benefits to humans of actually getting out into green space. So a part of what we do at the city, um, uh, when we're looking at site plans and looking at protecting wetlands and other what we call critical environmental features, is try to consider, you know, the value of green space and the value of green space to the community, aside from just, strictly following the rules like, oh, this is a wetland, it must be protected. But wetlands are varying quality and, varying location in the landscape that may or not work with certain types of development. But when we can, we try to preserve this green space and work with the development community to incorporate these into their communities. Wetlands are protected in a couple of places in code. These first were brought in to code and protected by the city in 1986 with a comprehensive watersheds ordinance. A lot of the information on how they're protected is in the ECM. And what we do at the city for wetlands is we follow, basically what was said in 1979 and what people accept as the criteria for wetlands, which was further refined by the Corps of Engineers in 1987, which is frequency of inundation. So it's hydrology, plants, and soils. Do you have the right kind of soils? Do you have the right kind of plants? And you have at least intermittent saturation of the soils. And it gets complicated because not all soils have indicators of whether or not they've been saturated, and plants, there's a continuum of things that are a little bit tolerant of saturation, and then things that you only ever find near waterways. So we rely on the basic core definition and the criteria there, and then we rely on the various manuals that have come out from Corps of Engineers and Forest Service and other agencies to clarify in specific cases, like, is this or is this not a wetland? And to facilitate our review of that, when people submit site plans or subdivision plans, they have to provide an environmental resource inventory. It looks for that has the MAT critical environmental features, which is rim rock, some of these cliff faces you see around town, and springs, and then of course recharge features, caves and sinkholes over the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone. So an applicant provides an ERI. We also go out and look around, see if we agree with everything that they've called a CEF or wetland on their site. And sometimes we wind up adding a couple more. Sometimes we go, that's not really a wetland. And then we work with the developer on protecting a buffer around that CEF, around that wetland. So here's one example of these are, like I said, we negotiate buffers, and this shows the plan for this site. This whole area, the wetlands that have been mapped are shown here in white with the green squiggles. Dashed areas, hatched areas are the negotiated buffers that were placed around those. So they said, well, there's a couple of nice wetland plants or wetland features here, and we can actually use these in our development as a focal point, places that like we were saying, can kind of be a part of the community and be a feature associated with your site. So we're going to have this buffer around it that is going to be semi-managed, but protected otherwise from development. And this is wound up actually becoming dedicated parkland as a part of the project. This funny cut, this longer cut here is actually where Breaker Lane is going to come through someday. Things have developed a lot in this area, even beyond what you see in this aerial photo. And these other funny notches are from the subdivision that's going to get built out there. And then there's a big old hatch down here that doesn't have any mapped features in it. That's because the developer is planning on installing a wet pond. So they're going to build their own pond that's going to have a permanent water surface. And then all this area around that will be protected, and our wet ponds get planted up with wetland plants along the fringe. So this was considered acceptable form of development. And again, this will be a feature for the neighborhood, a nice natural area, standing water, and lots of fish in it potentially. And if you've been around, say the ponds at Mueller, I think are the most obvious place. Just the amount of um, the variety of birds that come through these areas and make use of these areas is pretty remarkable. And then this here on the right is just the first page of the ERI, the Environmental Resource Inventory, where they start telling us what their site looks like and whether or not they think they have any wetlands or other CEFs. So the standard buffer for a wetland and for other CEFs is 150 feet. And like I said, that's just kind of the starting point on how we do this. Here you see a small channel where we negotiated, instead of keeping the full 150-foot buffer around every edge of it. We wanted to protect waters upstream of it and downstream of it, because there was a potential for maintaining higher functioning channel stream through here. And this was a small enough channel that wasn't protected by our critical water quality zone rules. So we got to put a little buffer on this channel and protect the whole thing, instead of, saying, well, you need to protect all of this around it. And, then the area upstream here, we have this buffer. So future development doesn't encroach too close onto the wetland either, if anything's going to be happening here. So we allow people to kind of move these buffers around, and we try to keep it kind of a one-to-one basis, although that can be reduced in the case of lower quality vegetation, lower quality stock tanks and that kind of thing. And then we also allow other possibilities for mitigating that. You can put what we call wet meadows in the bottom of the detention pond, where it's over excavated a little bit. So it's going to have more, maybe not fully saturated soils, but receive enough moisture. They'll have healthy vegetation growing there. We require native vegetation in those cases. In the case of detention ponds, that also has to be mowable, which can get a little tricky. And we work with people also on fencing, so the mowers don't get in and impact that buffer. And sometimes where there's significant risk of folks getting in, or where the developer thinks it's kind of a nice part of the package of having this preserved natural area, educational signage that explains what's going on there. And with the fencing can work to keep out mowers and property managers and such. And then wetlands themselves, not just those buffers we have around them, can be mitigated. Also, a pretty common thing, not anymore, is wet ponds are only allowed now under very specific circumstances. We don't see too many more wetlands coming online, but the vegetated benches are saturated and can function essentially as the soils there is saturated, and you get lots of nice wetland plants coming up. And a lot of times also we can put more of a buffer, or we can put a buffer beyond that as well. So we get something simulating, the wetland itself, and then that gradation, like we saw on the first slide, of things getting further from the water and everything changing as that happens. And then the additional support of wildlife and other nice things that allows. We've also talked to people some, I haven't seen one built uh, since I got this job. We've talked to people about doing constructed wetlands, and we have a few ideas on how that could happen. Um, Central Texas is not a great place to try and build a wetland because of the uncertainty of rainfall and the uncertainty of groundwater levels. And then you also have in, obviously rainfall patterns are changing. Rainfall is going to it seems to be becoming spikier, where there's dry periods punctuated by periods of fairly intense rainfall. And then as development spreads, like into eastern Travis County, where you see a lot of these nicer wetlands on the clay soil, groundwater seems to be going down pretty quickly. And as development continues out there, that has the potential to accelerate. So constructed wetlands and saying, oh yeah, that's a good place for a wetland. This is a pretty challenging place to try and do that. But we've been kicking around ideas with a few different developers, and maybe somebody will try that one of these days. Let's see. So I don't, let's see. So again, this I showed this earlier. Great wetland, great access to groundwater. You can see it extending even further into the back there. We would protect this whole thing. It's great, love it. This one looks pretty bad. Why is this a wetland? It doesn't even have any vegetation. Um, but looking at aerial photos, you see that it had a consistent source of water. Things always got water in it, rarely dries out. What's happening here is you see all these divots down here. Those are hoof prints, and this area was used to manage livestock. Livestock love, well, of course, they're getting into to access the water, but also they love wetland vegetation. It's like lettuce to them or something. They just chow down on it. So highly degraded, currently low quality wetland. But those wetlands over time, once you take livestock off the land, they can actually recover pretty quickly. This has all these young trees around it, and the vegetation starting to come in. These can still, kind of a small footprint, but these can recover pretty quickly and start, you know, um, providing the services that wetlands provide in a pretty short time frame. Once the impact, the disturbance from the cattle is removed. So, we get questions about, why is that a wetland and why do we have to protect that? That's because, you're not going to be running cattle on it anymore. You can start getting some of these services from it uh, that wetlands can provide. And here's another example of kind of this network of okay, this area's obviously been impacted by livestock, and probably been used as a hay meadow when it wasn't being when cattle weren't out on it. Um, and not a lot of great vegetation, but these waterways coming through here. You can see these patterns in the soil. A lot of uh, eastern Travis County kind of goes back and forth between Houston black soil, which is a very rich, dense soil that forms wetlands pretty readily, and then a lot of old alluvial material, basically sand, that erodes very easily. So you see these strange patterns in the soil here, and you see some of these shadows are down cutting. as you get new development coming in, like here's a development and there's a pond here that discharges this way, those soils, the sand is not very resistant to the force of water, and you start putting more water on it, and things start down cutting, and you run into trouble. So another thing we sometimes do is these small channels, as I showed on the other one, we like to protect those. And so in this case, yeah, we worked with the developer to protect this larger one that seemed to have a good source of water and set up a buffer around it. These others that don't have any buffer around them, we basically decided those were unprotected and they didn't need to keep those wetlands as long as they provided to us the buffer along the waterway itself, where you can get better vegetation can come in and help protect that stream. And in some circumstances, I don't recall if it was the case with this one. But a lot of times what we'll do is we're saying, okay, that's not a great wetland, that can go away. But protect this and also plant it up. So yeah, when I was talking about generally moving around buffers, another thing you can do is you can lose some buffer, um, reduce the size of the buffer if you provide mitigation elsewhere. So in this case, so oh, these wetlands can go away, but plant this all up nicely for us and try and protect that creek. And here's an example of these being incorporated into the community and providing kind of a natural, natural setting in the middle of this development out in eastern Travis County. What's this called? Meadowland, something like that. I forget the name of the development. But yeah, they've instituted a nice trail network, and again, this pond has pretty consistent water availability, so it's going to support lots of vegetation and wildlife and waterfowl and so forth. And I guess that's it. That's what I got so far. Sorry, I just ran out of slides. I forgot what my last slide was.
Thanks, John. Really important information for us all to understand. What is a wetland? Why is it important? And like you said, especially here in Texas, they're so rare and unpredictable as to how can we sustain these. It's like we need to be careful with what we do have. And I guess that's what all these rules are about. That's what the history is showing us. Thank you for that. Let's see, I'm gonna go into our Q&A session now, and I'll review kind of our format. So as we mentioned at the beginning, there are two ways that you can ask questions. So one option will be to post a question to the Q&A bank by clicking that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and I can read your question and either John or Miranda will go ahead and respond. And the other option would be for you to ask your question verbally. And in order to do that, you'll raise your hand by clicking the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And I'll call your name and Zoom will prompt you to allow your account to be unmuted. So in order to ensure that we're covering questions in both formats, I'm going to toggle between the two. And I'll go ahead and get started with one of the questions that we have in our Q&A bank. So the first question I've got here says, what happens if the shore of a lake or creek overlaps with a wetland? Do we have to calculate for all of those mitigation requirements, or does one take precedent over the other?
Yeah, that is it often depends on the situation. So with creeks, there's the critical water quality zone, and that's typically where you'll run into if you're getting right up next to it. Um, you could be both in the buffer of a wetland and in the critical water quality zone. And it depends on the circumstances, the quality of what's there. A lot of times it will require two separate forms of mitigation. Like we don't let folks double dip, as you say. But there's also it's really a case by case basis, depending on the extent of the impact and the quality of the the condition of the buffer, both in terms of uh, the critical water quality zone and the CEF buffer.
Thank you. And we've got about 10-15 minutes for Q&A. I don't have any more currently in the Q&A box, but let's give it a little bit of time and see, do any of our participants have any more questions? Feel free to submit that in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand as well. All right, I see something just came into the box. Are all livestock ponds automatically considered wetlands?
Um, we consider whether, but basically we look at them and look at their current condition and what would likely be their condition when livestock are removed. So let's see, and actually that may not be exactly what you're asking. So livestock ponds in general, you know, based on when they were created and whether or not there's currently livestock there. Um, if the three factors are present, then yes, we would consider it a wetland. Soils, hydrology, and plants. And if they're not present, we would look at is there disturbance that is hiding the fact that it's a wetland? It just doesn't look like it, like all the plants are eaten down and trampled by cattle. So if we still decide that yes, the three conditions are met, given these disturbances, yes, we would call it a wetland. It doesn't mean that we're going to put 150-foot buffer around it and not let you ever touch it. Again, kind of based on the quality of the wetland, the frequency of inundation, its potential to support the unique plant communities there. We negotiate the size of the buffer, or again, if maybe the wetland can just go away completely.
Very good. And I think you said that the buffer is only 150 feet.
Yeah, and that can be reduced for very poor wetlands. Um, we discussed this internally a lot, like where the boundary, where do we draw the line on this needs some kind of mitigation versus, well, that's they can do this instead. So yeah, standard 150-foot, which is just kind of the place to begin talking about how to protect it and what's the best type of mitigation for it, because that perfectly even 150-foot buffer isn't necessarily the best thing for the health of the wetland, or if it's one of these stock pond that's in line with a small channel, the health of the stock pond and the channel itself. So then we say, yeah, you can squeeze in on the side, just give us more of the creek. And if that happens to be on the side of the development anyways, then that often works very well. And we get, a 50-foot buffer along a stretch of creek and a 50-foot buffer off the wetland, instead of just that full 150-foot just around the wetland. So it takes a little back and forth, which can be stressful for folks sometimes, but really just trying to figure out how to bring these features into developments in a sustainable way that works for the community and works for the protection of the environment.
Because that's a good example. I got another comment, I think, from the last question about livestock ponds, that just stating that it seems like the NWI shows livestock ponds as
Yeah,
weblands. I'm not sure what the
and that's
NWI is.
the National Wetlands Inventory. There's
Sorry about that.
right now it's a website you can go to and just pan around. We also have something similar for the city identified wetlands and property profile. Probably a lot of people know about that already. So yeah, basically I think NWI basically just spots open water on the landscape, and that would catch a lot of the, certainly the higher quality livestock ponds that are out there.
Neat. I wasn't aware of that resource. Thanks for sharing that. Next question, what is the process to initiate the discussion with watershed protection if you know that you do have a wetland?
Emailing me or Miranda is what usually happens. There's also, because people are concerned how it's going to impact them, and then also I'm kind of notoriously slow on responding to emails, unfortunately. But there's more formal approaches also, depending on the kind of work. You can submit something like a site plan exemption to say, well, maybe can I just do this work without a site plan? There's also concept site plans where you can get formal comments back from the city, not just from the wetland biologist, but from all of the reviewers telling you how they would review it if it were coming in as a site plan right now. Um, but for those initial questions, trying to understand what's going on, if you are concerned that you're going to have critical environmental features and you know you're going to be submitting a site plan, um, you're gonna, if you have any of the triggers for a CEF, which is wetlands and other things. So basically, if you go, oh, that's probably a wetland, you're probably going to need an ERI, which means you're going to hire an environmental consultant to do that. So one thing you could do is discuss with an environmental consultant, is the city going to call this a wetland? What are they going to make us do, and so forth. Or yes, you can also reach out to me, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can.
Good.
Uh,
Sorry, do you want to add?
oh no, I was just reading the next one, but you do that. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
good
Okay,
job.
next question. What happens if you need to mitigate and the only areas available contain bedrock with no soils on them?
And that comes up for all CEFs, because springs, rimrock, and karst features are all things you see a lot of in West Austin, Western Travis, and Hayes counties. Um, and again, it depends on the quality of the feature. If it's a high quality feature, um, we might just say we don't want you doing it. And that could potentially come down to the applicant requesting a land use commission variance to it. Um, Depending on, also in those cases, we consider the actual impact. If it's a highly constrained site and the applicant is just trying to make it work, make the site developable, there's potential that we would just say, okay, you know, it's reduced to 100 feet, 100-foot buffer, give us a 100-foot buffer. Also, there's things that can be done uh, more within the site. I mentioned wet meadows for detention. That gets a little tricky nowadays. Everybody seems to be doing stacked detention where there's not a separate detention pond from water quality. They have the water quality pond and the detention volume sits on top of that. So wet meadows and detention ponds are becoming less common now also. Um, and we used to also say, well, you've got a sand filter for your water quality, give us a biofiltration pond, and that can be your mitigation. But now, GSI, green stormwater, which includes biofiltration pond, is required for most site plans. So we don't really get to call that mitigation anymore. There's also things like looking at the outfalls, especially for the water quality pond. Um, that's water comes into the water quality pond and it goes out pretty slowly. Water goes into the detention pond and it still comes out pretty fast, especially the bigger the storm, the faster the water is going to be coming out. So we do like to, well, one thing we like to do is make sure that anything downstream of the detention outfall is protected from erosion. And we can work with you on ways that are a little more soft touch and green for that, especially if it's heading towards the wetland or other protected feature. And then for the biofiltration or other GSI outlet, where the water is slowly released over 48 hours, that's some water availability that could support better vegetation also. And we work with folks on getting a little swale or something in there as mitigation. Also in the ECM, in these things, the biofiltration ponds and rain gardens that have under drains, you can actually raise the outlet of that. So you get water stored. It's under the surface of the water. Under the surface of the media in the bottom of the pond. So you don't have standing water and mosquitoes and stuff like that. But you can store that water and you have more availability of water for the plants in the pond, and you can have more productive biofiltration pond. We consider that a kind of mitigation also. So those are the kinds of things that would work with someone on that case. And sometimes just go, yeah, there's not much you can do with that site. It's okay to get this much closer to it. It really depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, great answer. There's a lot of detail there. I do have one more question, and I think this is going to be our last one because we're almost out of time. If someone is adamant about mowing and doesn't want to protect the wetland area from being mowed, are there certain plant species you would recommend for that level of disturbance?
Yeah, there are, it's not great. Let's see. Um, there's not tons of stuff like that are available. What's it called? Straggler daisy and potentially uh, let's see, frog fruit is another good one. And for grasses, these low growing saws like buffalo and is it blue grama they have around here? Yeah, blue grama. And there's also a hairy grama. And so basically there's a half dozen to a dozen low growing species that you can get usually just as seed. Sometimes with the frog fruit and the straggler daisy, you can get those in 4-inch pots and get those planted up and get the area seeded up with these native species. Generally, so just the way the question is worded, it sounds like this is kind of an after the fact thing. You want someone to stop mowing it so you get more variety there, or in areas where, again, we've negotiated some sort of recreational use of the area, or for some other reason, like in a detention pond, you can't have woody vegetation and bigger stuff coming up, so it needs to be mowed. Then yeah, there's a few species that can be used for that. Basically, you just go around looking for some of the smaller stuff. There's other small bunch grasses that can probably handle some mowing. Some other little legumes, smaller than bluebonnet or smaller. Also, if it's an area that could be managed as a wildflower meadow that only gets mowed once a year, that's potential also where you know it just gets it depends because mowing once a year can help keep down the woody vegetation, uh, but wildflower meadows are another option in some circumstances other than just really low growing stuff.
Thank you. So there are options for those situations that aren't necessarily ideal. It's good to know. And they're native options too, so wonderful. I would love to keep talking more, and I appreciate everyone's questions. So we're gonna wrap it up. It is noon. So we're gonna conclude the meeting. Again, everyone who registered, or sorry, everyone who attended will receive a link to today's meeting materials, and we'll include the responses to any of the questions that were asked. There were some that were asked during the presentation that we did not read out loud, and those will be included in the summary. If you do find that you have an additional question that you didn't have an opportunity to ask, you can always email us at dsdcommunications@austintexas.gov, and we'll forward that over to John or Miranda. we'll be happy to get you whatever information you need. As you can see, there is the engagement survey. We want to know, what did you think of today's presentation? The QR is on the screen, but then I also put a link in the chat. And finally, if you're interested in any further educational classes, check out the Land Development Academy webpage. Our next presentation is going to be taking place on Tuesday next week, November 4th. Kenna Pierce is going to present about Austin's water quality requirements. So thanks everyone again. And John, Miranda, do you have any closing words for us? No? All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, y'all.